They trashed the car, thinking they could get away with it, but they didn't know that its owner was Big Shaq himself. What happened next will surprise you. Subscribe and comment where you're watching from. The sun hung low over the horizon, casting a warm, golden glow over a small southern town known for its long highways, friendly diners, and an air of simplicity. The streets were bustling in the way only such towns could be, a mix of families enjoying an evening out, truckers stopping for meals, and a few locals exchanging gossip on the sidewalks. The centerpiece of the activity was a well-known diner that had stood there for decades, its neon sign flickering proudly as the smell of sizzling barbecue wafted through the air. The diner's parking lot stretched wide, accommodating everything from semi-trucks to motorcycles. A buzz of life surrounded the area, with kids laughing near their parents' minivans, a few stray dogs lazily watching the scene, and occasional bursts of laughter from the open windows of parked cars. The sound of engines starting and stopping created a constant hum. Amid the humdrum, the sleek arrival of a black SUV disrupted the natural rhythm of the evening. Its glossy surface reflected the fading light like a mirror, the tinted windows hiding whoever was inside. The car moved with measured precision, finding a spot near the diner's entrance. It parked perfectly, the tires aligning neatly within the lines, exuding an air of quiet dominance. The driver's door opened, and out stepped a man whose presence was impossible to ignore. He was tall, exceptionally tall, and his build was as commanding as his height. He wore a simple gray hoodie, loose athletic pants, and sneakers, but even the casual attire couldn't disguise the sheer power he exuded. His steps were slow, unhurried, and deliberate. Those nearby glanced in his direction but quickly returned to their conversations, perhaps sensing that he was someone important, though they couldn't quite place him. This man was Shaquille O'Neal, retired basketball superstar and cultural icon. While his fame spanned continents, tonight he was just another traveler, stopping for a quick bite before continuing his journey. His demeanor was calm, even humble, as he entered the diner and approached the counter. Inside, the atmosphere was warm and welcoming, filled with the chatter of patrons and the occasional clink of utensils against plates. Shaq ordered a double cheeseburger, a large basket of fries, and a soda. The cashier smiled as she handed him his receipt, her expression showing faint recognition but no overt reaction. In a place like this, the big city glamour of basketball fame often took a backseat to the simpler joys of life. As Shaq waited for his meal, he leaned against the counter, his broad frame blending into the easygoing ambiance. Outside, however, something was beginning to stir that would soon shatter the calm of the evening. The first sign of trouble came in the form of a low, rumbling noise, a growl that grew louder with each passing second. Heads turned as a group of motorcycles roared onto the lot, their chrome exteriors gleaming under the streetlights. 6 bikes in total, each more intimidating than the last, came to a stop near the center of the parking lot. Their riders dismounted, clad in black leather and heavy boots, chains swinging from their belts as they moved. At the head of the group was a man with a shaved head and a goatee that framed his perpetual scowl. This was Rick "Thunder" Matthews, the leader of the group and a man known for his volatile temper. He glanced around the parking lot, his eyes scanning the vehicles as if looking for something or someone to take his anger out on. The other riders followed his lead, their postures cocky, their attitudes radiating aggression. They had just been thrown out of a bar a few miles down the road after starting a fight with the staff. Rick was still seething from the encounter, his knuckles white as he gripped his helmet. He needed an outlet, and the perfect target presented itself when his eyes landed on the shiny black SUV parked near the diner's entrance. "That thing's taken up 2 spaces," he growled, loud enough for his crew to hear. "Some rich jerk thinks he owns the place." The group turned to look at the SUV. It did indeed occupy slightly more space than necessary, though it was hardly enough to warrant the rage it sparked in Rick. But reason wasn't part of Rick's vocabulary tonight. His mood demanded destruction, and the SUV, with its flawless paint job and spotless windows, was the perfect canvas. Rick motioned for his crew to follow him, and they approached the vehicle. One of the younger members, Danny, hesitated slightly, glancing around as if expecting someone to intervene. The others, however, followed Rick with no such reservations. "Let's teach this guy a lesson," Rick said, pulling a key from his pocket and dragging it along the side of the SUV. The screech of metal on metal cut through the air, drawing a few curious looks from the people in the lot. No one moved to stop them, though. The gang's reputation was well known, and most bystanders preferred to stay out of their way. Rick's act of vandalism was just the beginning. His second-in-command, Pete "Scar" Jenkins, laughed and kicked the side mirror clean off, sending it clattering to the ground. Another biker, John "Nail" Thompson, grabbed a rock and hurled it at the windshield, causing a spiderweb of cracks to spread across the glass. "Nice one," Rick barked, his voice filled with cruel amusement. "Come on, don't hold back." The others joined in, kicking the tires, slamming their fists against the body of the SUV, and even throwing a trash can onto the hood. The parking lot seemed to hold its breath as the destruction continued. A few customers inside the diner glanced out the window, their faces a mixture of shock and fear. Yet none of them dared to intervene. Inside the diner, Shaq's order was finally ready. He thanked the cashier and picked up his tray, oblivious to what was happening just outside. He took a seat by the window, his large frame dwarfing the booth, and began to eat, savoring the meal after a long day of driving. Outside, Rick and his crew had reached a fever pitch. The SUV, once a symbol of power and elegance, now looked like a battered wreck. Rick leaned against his bike, admiring their handiwork with a smirk. "That'll teach him," he muttered, lighting a cigarette as his crew cheered. "Whoever owns this thing better think twice next time." Unbeknownst to them, the owner of the SUV was just finishing his burger, and when Shaq stepped outside, the peaceful evening they had so callously disrupted was about to take a dramatic turn. The atmosphere in the parking lot had shifted from its earlier calm into something tense and charged. The air was thick with the acrid smell of burnt rubber and cigarette smoke. The sound of the bikers' laughter echoed through the otherwise quiet evening, filling the space with an edge of cruelty. Rick "Thunder" Matthews stood at the center of the chaos, his arms crossed over his chest, surveying the destruction like a general overseeing a successful campaign. The black SUV, once pristine and commanding, was now unrecognizable. The glossy paint was marred by deep gouges. Its side mirror lay shattered on the asphalt, and the windshield bore a network of cracks that shimmered in the flickering light of the parking lot's street lamps. Trash from the upturned bin spilled across the hood, creating a grotesque collage of fast food wrappers and spilled soda. One tire sagged pathetically, its air hissing out from a knife puncture courtesy of Pete "Scar" Jenkins. "Looks like a proper lesson now, doesn't it?" Rick said, grinning as he turned to his crew. His voice carried an edge of pride, as if he'd just accomplished something meaningful. "Bet whoever owns this piece of junk will think twice before pulling a stunt like this again." "Damn right," Pete added, tossing the knife he'd used to puncture the tire into the air and catching it deftly. He was a wiry man with a permanent sneer etched into his face, his movements sharp and deliberate. Rich folks like this think they can walk all over us. Not today. The younger members of the gang nodded in agreement, though their enthusiasm didn't quite match that of their older companions. Danny, one of the rookies, shifted uneasily on his feet, his eyes darting between the destroyed vehicle and the other bikers. He hadn't participated in the carnage, though he'd cheered along half-heartedly to avoid drawing attention. "Maybe we should get out of here," Danny said, his voice low but trembling with the weight of his words. "What if someone saw us?" Rick shot him a sharp glare, his lips curling into a snarl. "You scared of a little heat, kid? Nobody's gonna mess with us. This is our town." Danny opened his mouth to respond, but he caught himself and looked away, nodding in submission. The others laughed, their confidence bolstered by Rick's unshakable arrogance. While Rick basked in his perceived victory, John Nail Thompson and Bob Ram Myers took it a step further. John, a stocky man with a shaved head, pulled out his phone and started taking pictures of the wreckage, posing beside the SUV like it was a trophy. Bob joined him, flexing his muscles and making exaggerated gestures at the mangled vehicle. "Let's send this to the guys back at the bar," John said, laughing. "Show 'em what happens when someone crosses the Thunder Riders." "Good idea," Rick replied, the corners of his mouth twitching upward in approval. "Make sure they see who's in charge around here." The bikers continued their antics, their voices growing louder with each passing moment. Despite the growing noise, the few people still lingering near the diner kept their distance, either pretending not to notice or quietly slipping away. Fear hung in the air like a thick fog, immobilizing anyone who might have otherwise intervened. Inside the diner, Shaquille O'Neal was finishing his meal. He had chosen a seat by the window, unaware that just a few feet away, chaos was unfolding. His focus was on his food, the flavors providing a small moment of comfort after a long day on the road. As he sipped his soda, he caught sight of movement outside the window. A group of men stood near his SUV, laughing and gesturing wildly. At first, he didn't think much of it. People often admired the car, sometimes taking photos, but something about their demeanor struck him as odd. Their laughter wasn't the friendly, admiring kind he was used to. It was harsh and mocking. He frowned, leaning forward slightly to get a better look. It took a moment for the reality of the situation to sink in. He noticed the trash on the hood, the shattered glass, the scratched paint. Slowly, deliberately, he set down his drink and wiped his hands on a napkin. His movements were calm, but his jaw tightened ever so slightly. Outside, Rick and his crew were starting to feel the adrenaline of their actions fade, replaced by the smug satisfaction of a job well done. They were already discussing their next destination, a bar on the outskirts of town, when the door to the diner swung open. Shaq stepped out into the parking lot, his towering frame casting a long shadow across the asphalt. He walked with the same deliberate pace he always did, each step exuding quiet authority. The bikers didn't notice him at first, too caught up in their own bravado. But as he approached the wrecked SUV, his imposing presence became impossible to ignore. "Who the hell is that?" Bob muttered, his voice dropping as he nudged Rick with his elbow. Rick turned to look, his confident smirk faltering ever so slightly as he took in the sheer size of the man approaching them. Shaq was a force of nature, his broad shoulders and steady stride radiating an energy that was hard to pin down but impossible to dismiss. The two groups were now mere feet apart, and the parking lot seemed to grow unnaturally quiet. Even the wind had died down, leaving only the sound of Shaq's footsteps and the faint hum of the diner's neon sign. Rick recovered quickly, his expression hardening as he stepped forward to meet the stranger. "Something we can help you with, big guy?" he asked, his tone laced with sarcasm. Shaq stopped in front of his SUV, his eyes sweeping over the damage before slowly lifting to meet Rick's gaze. His expression was unreadable, but there was a weight to his silence that made the bikers shift uneasily. "Yeah," Shaq said finally, his voice calm but firm. "You can tell me who did this." The bikers exchanged glances, a mix of amusement and apprehension flickering across their faces. Rick, however, wasn't about to back down. He crossed his arms over his chest, a smirk playing at his lips. "That'd be us," he said, his voice dripping with mockery. "You got a problem with that?" The tension in the air was palpable, and for the first time that evening, the bikers felt a flicker of uncertainty. They didn't know who this man was, but something about him told them they were about to find out. The silence in the parking lot was heavy, oppressive even, as Shaquille O'Neal stood facing the gang of bikers who had turned his once pristine SUV into a wreck. His imposing frame towered over them, yet his expression remained calm, almost unreadable. He wasn't one to act on impulse, but the sight of his ruined vehicle stirred a quiet storm within him. Rick Thunder Matthews, leader of the Thunder Riders, held his ground, though a flicker of unease crossed his face. He was a man accustomed to being the most intimidating figure in any room or parking lot, but Shaq's sheer presence was enough to give even him pause. The rest of the bikers exchanged nervous glances, their earlier bravado fading as the reality of the situation set in. "What's the matter, big guy?" Rick sneered, masking his uncertainty with arrogance. He took a step forward, standing just a few feet from Shaq. "You mad about your toy? Should have thought about where you parked it." Shaq's gaze shifted to Rick, calm but piercing. He didn't respond immediately, letting the weight of his silence hang in the air. Around them, the parking lot seemed to hold its breath, the distant hum of passing cars and the flicker of the diner's neon sign the only sounds. "You did this?" Shaq finally asked, his voice low but carrying an edge of steel. He wasn't asking for confirmation. He already knew. The question was more of a challenge, a final opportunity for Rick and his crew to back down. Rick chuckled, though the sound was hollow. "Damn right we did. You think you can just roll in here like you own the place? Someone had to teach you a lesson." "Looks like you taught my car," Shaq replied, his tone even, almost conversational. But there was something in his eyes, a quiet intensity that made the hairs on the back of Rick's neck stand on end. Rick wasn't about to let himself be intimidated, not in front of his crew. He squared his shoulders, motioning toward the SUV with a dismissive wave of his hand. "Yeah, we did. And if you don't like it, maybe you should take it up with—" Before Rick could finish his sentence, one of the younger bikers, Danny, interrupted. "Hey, Rick, maybe we should just—" "Shut it, Danny," Rick snapped, not even glancing back at him. "I'm handling this." Shaq's eyes flicked toward Danny, who immediately looked down at his boots, his face flushing with embarrassment. Shaq could see the hesitation in him, the reluctance to follow Rick's lead, but he didn't comment. Instead, he turned his attention back to Rick. "You don't seem to understand," Shaq said, his voice steady, measured. "This isn't about the car anymore. It's about respect." Rick's smirk faltered. "Respect?" he repeated, his tone dripping with mockery. "You think you can just walk in here and demand respect?" "I don't have to demand it," Shaq replied. "I give it, and I expect it in return." The calm in his voice was unnerving, and for a moment Rick faltered, but his pride and the eyes of his crew pushed him forward. He stepped closer, his hand resting on the chain that hung from his belt. "Listen, I don't know who you think you are," Rick said, his voice low, "but you're outnumbered. So unless you want to end up like your fancy car, I'd suggest you—" Rick's words were cut off as Shaq took a single step forward, closing the distance between them. The movement was so deliberate, so controlled, that it sent a ripple of unease through the gang. Shaq didn't raise his voice, didn't make a threatening gesture. He didn't need to. His sheer presence was enough to make even the boldest of them hesitate. "You don't want to do this," Shaq said, his voice quiet but firm. "Walk away, now." The tension was palpable, and for a brief moment it seemed as though Rick might back down. But his pride and the need to save face in front of his crew overruled his better judgment. He took another step forward, reaching for the chain at his belt. "All right, big guy," Rick said, his smirk returning. "Let's see what you've got." The rest of the gang followed Rick's lead, moving to surround Shaq. Pete "Scar" Jenkins cracked his knuckles, his wiry frame vibrating with anticipation. John "Nail" Thompson pulled out a crowbar, his expression a mix of excitement and nervous energy. Bob "Ram" Myers stood to the side, his bulk adding an extra layer of menace to the group. Danny lingered at the edge of the circle, his hesitation written all over his face. Shaq took a deep breath, his gaze sweeping over the group. He didn't want this to escalate, but he could see there was no reasoning with Rick and his crew. They were spoiling for a fight, and he knew he had no choice but to defend himself. Rick swung first, the chain in his hand arcing toward Shaq's shoulder. But Shaq was faster. He stepped to the side with surprising agility for a man of his size, catching the chain mid-swing. With a quick twist of his wrist, he yanked it out of Rick's hand and tossed it to the ground. The bikers froze for a moment, stunned by the ease with which Shaq had disarmed their leader. But the moment passed quickly, and the others surged forward. Pete lunged at Shaq, his fists swinging wildly, but Shaq blocked the blows effortlessly. With a quick shove, he sent Pete stumbling backward, tripping over his own feet and landing hard on the asphalt. John swung the crowbar, aiming for Shaq's ribs, but Shaq caught it mid-swing, the metal bar vibrating in his grip. He pulled it out of John's hands with a single motion and dropped it to the ground. Bob tried to grab Shaq from behind, but Shaq twisted out of his grip using his massive frame to overpower the larger man. With a controlled push, he sent Bob staggering into one of the motorcycles, which toppled over with a loud crash. Within moments, 3 of the bikers were either on the ground or retreating, leaving only Rick and Danny standing. Rick's face was a mixture of anger and disbelief, his hands clenched into fists. "You're gonna regret this," Rick snarled, but his voice lacked the confidence it had before. Shaq didn't respond. He simply stepped forward, his gaze locked on Rick. The look in his eyes was enough to make Rick take a step back. "You had your chance to walk away," Shaq said, his voice calm but unyielding. "Don't make me regret giving it to you." For the first time that evening, Rick hesitated. The balance of power had shifted, and he could feel it. Around him, his crew was either on the ground or retreating, their earlier bravado replaced by fear. Danny took a step back, his hands raised in a gesture of surrender. I didn't do anything," he stammered, his voice shaken. "I swear." Shaq's gaze softened slightly as he looked at Danny. "Then walk away," he said simply. Danny didn't need to be told twice. He turned and ran, his footsteps echoing through the parking lot. Rick watched him go, his jaw tightening. He turned back to Shaq, his fists still clenched, but the fight had gone out of him. "This isn't over," Rick muttered, backing away. "You'll pay for this." Shaq didn't respond. He simply watched as Rick retreated, his hands still at his sides, his posture calm but ready. When the parking lot finally fell silent, Shaq let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. The confrontation was over, but the night was far from finished. The parking lot was eerily quiet in the wake of the confrontation. The battered black SUV stood as a grim testament to the chaos that had unfolded, its once pristine exterior now scarred and broken. Shaquille O'Neal remained standing in the center of the lot, his massive frame illuminated by the flickering neon sign of the diner. His breath was steady, his movements controlled, but the tension in his muscles betrayed the storm simmering beneath his calm exterior. Rick "Thunder" Matthews hadn't gone far. Despite his retreat, the leader of the Thunder Riders wasn't one to accept defeat easily. He stood by his toppled motorcycle, rubbing his wrist where Shaq had disarmed him moments earlier. His eyes burned with a mix of anger and humiliation. His pride demanded retaliation, and as his crew slowly picked themselves up from the asphalt, he barked out orders. "Get up!" Rick shouted, his voice hoarse with fury. "We're not done here." Pete "Scar" Jenkins, still nursing a bruised ego and a scraped elbow, staggered to his feet. His wiry frame trembled with adrenaline, and his sneer returned as he looked toward Shaq. John "Nail" Thompson retrieved the crowbar Shaq had discarded, gripping it tightly as if it could restore his courage. Bob "Ram" Myers, the largest of the group, wiped blood from his lip and gave a curt nod to Rick, ready for round two. Shaq stood silently, watching them regroup. He could see the determination in their eyes, but he also saw the hesitation lurking just beneath the surface. They were angry, humiliated, and desperate to save face, but they were also beginning to realize that they were outmatched. It didn't matter how many of them there were. Shaq's presence alone was enough to make them falter. "You're making a mistake," Shaq said, his deep voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "Walk away while you still can." Rick laughed, though the sound was hollow. "You think you've won, big guy? This isn't over until I say it's over." Without warning, Rick lunged forward, swinging a metal chain he'd retrieved from his bike. The chain sliced through the air with a menacing hiss, aimed directly at Shaq's head. But Shaq was ready. With a fluid motion, he stepped to the side, narrowly avoiding the strike. His hand shot out, grabbing the chain mid-swing. The force of Rick's attack stopped cold as Shaq's grip tightened around the links. Rick's eyes widened in shock as Shaq yanked the chain from his hands, the sheer strength of the motion sending him stumbling forward. Shaq tossed the chain to the ground and stepped back, giving Rick one last chance to back down. But Rick was too far gone, his anger clouding his judgment. He charged at Shaq, his fists swinging wildly. Shaq sidestepped the first punch, then the second, his movements smooth and deliberate. With a well-timed shift of his weight, he planted a hand on Rick's shoulder and used his momentum against him, sending the smaller man sprawling onto the pavement. "Stay down," Shaq said, his voice firm but calm. It wasn't a request, it was a warning. The rest of the gang hesitated, exchanging uncertain glances. Pete was the first to step forward, his fists clenched and his expression twisted with defiance. He swung at Shaq, aiming for his ribs, but Shaq blocked the blow with ease, his massive hand catching Pete's wrist mid-swing. A quick twist of Shaq's arm sent Pete stumbling backward, clutching his wrist in pain. John followed suit, raising the crowbar above his head and charging at Shaq with a roar. Shaq ducked under the swing and grabbed the crowbar, wrenching it from John's grasp with a single motion. The force of the move sent John tumbling to the ground, where he stayed, groaning in defeat. Bob was next, his sheer size and strength making him the most formidable of the group. He approached Shaq cautiously, his fists raised in a boxer's stance. The two men squared off, their eyes locked. Bob threw a powerful punch aimed at Shaq's chest, but Shaq caught the blow with both hands, absorbing the impact and twisting Bob's arm into a painful hold. With a controlled shove, Shaq sent him stumbling backward into a parked car, the sound of metal crunching under his weight. One by one, the bikers fell. Their earlier bravado was replaced by frustration and fear as they realized that Shaq wasn't just bigger than them, he was smarter, faster, and more controlled. Each move he made was precise, calculated to neutralize their attacks without causing unnecessary harm. He wasn't fighting to prove a point or to humiliate them. He was fighting to end this. Rick, still sprawled on the ground, watched in disbelief as his crew was systematically taken down. His pride was shattered, his reputation in ruins. He struggled to his feet, his hands trembling as he reached for a knife hidden in his boot. "Rick, don't!" Danny's voice rang out, breaking the tension. The young biker had been watching from the sidelines, his face pale and his hands shaking. "You don't have to do this." "Stay out of this, Danny!" Rick snapped, his voice dripping with venom. He turned back to Shaq, the knife glinting in his hand. "This ends now." Shaq's eyes narrowed as he saw the blade. He didn't move, waiting for Rick to make the first move. The air was thick with tension, every second stretching into an eternity. Rick lunged forward, the knife aimed at Shaq's chest. But Shaq was ready. He sidestepped the attack, his hand shooting out to grab Rick's wrist. With a swift motion, he twisted Rick's arm, forcing him to drop the knife. The blade clattered to the ground, and Shaq kicked it away out of reach. Rick cried out in pain as Shaq applied just enough pressure to immobilize him without causing serious harm. He released Rick's arm and stepped back, his gaze unwavering. "It's over," Shaq said, his voice low but commanding. "Walk away." For a moment, Rick looked like he might argue, but the pain in his arm and the defeat in his crew's eyes told him otherwise. He staggered backward, clutching his wrist and glaring at Shaq with a mixture of anger and humiliation. "This isn't over," Rick muttered, his voice barely audible. But there was no conviction in his words. Shaq didn't respond. He simply watched as Rick stumbled toward his bike, his crew following suit. One by one, they mounted their motorcycles and roared out of the parking lot, their tails between their legs. As the sound of their engines faded into the distance, the parking lot fell silent once more. Shaq stood alone, his breath steady and his posture calm. He glanced at his battered SUV, then back toward the diner, where a small crowd had gathered by the windows, watching in stunned silence. The confrontation was over, but Shaq knew the night wasn't finished. There would be consequences, and he was ready for them. For now, though, he allowed himself a moment of peace, the quiet satisfaction of knowing he had done what needed to be done. The rumble of the Thunder Riders' motorcycles faded into the distance, leaving behind a strange, eerie stillness in the parking lot. The tension that had hung thick in the air slowly dissipated, replaced by an almost surreal calm. Shaquille O'Neal stood beside his battered SUV, his towering frame silhouetted against the flickering neon lights of the diner. The damage to his car was extensive. Scratched paint, shattered windows, slashed tires, but he didn't look at it with anger or regret. Instead, his gaze lingered in the direction the bikers had fled, his expression one of quiet contemplation. Inside the diner, the small crowd of patrons that had gathered at the windows began to stir. Whispers rippled through the room as people exchanged wide-eyed glances, trying to process what they had just witnessed. A few brave souls stepped outside, their curiosity outweighing their hesitation. Among them was the diner's manager, a middle-aged man with a pot belly and a nervous energy about him. He wiped his hands on his apron as he approached Shaq cautiously. "Hey, you okay, man?" the manager asked, his voice tinged with both concern and awe. "That was something else." Shaq turned to face him, his calm demeanor unshaken. "I'm fine," he replied, his deep voice steady. He glanced at his SUV, then back at the manager. "Car's not, though." The manager winced, his eyes darting to the mangled vehicle. "Yeah, they really did a number on it. You want me to call the cops or something?" Shaq paused, considering the question. He knew that involving the police might escalate things further, especially if the Thunder Riders had a reputation in this town. On the other hand, letting them get away with what they'd done didn't sit right with him. "I'll handle it," he said finally, his tone leaving no room for argument. "But thanks." The manager nodded, clearly relieved to avoid further involvement. "Well, if you need anything, let me know. Coffee's on the house at least." Shaq gave him a small, appreciative nod before turning back to his car. He crouched down, inspecting the damage more closely. The tires were completely deflated, and the windshield was a web of cracks that distorted the reflections of the parking lot lights. It was clear that driving the SUV anywhere was out of the question. A sudden voice broke through his thoughts. "Excuse me, sir." Shaq looked up to see a young man standing a few feet away, shifting nervously from foot to foot. It was Danny, the youngest member of the Thunder Riders. His leather jacket hung awkwardly on his slight frame, and his face was pale, a stark contrast to the cocky bravado he'd displayed earlier. Shaq straightened, towering over the boy. "You need something?" Danny hesitated, glancing around as if to make sure no one else was watching. His voice was barely above a whisper when he spoke. I wanted to say I'm sorry for what they did. I didn't touch your car, I swear." Shaq studied him for a moment, his expression unreadable. He could see the fear in Danny's eyes, but also something else. Guilt, maybe even regret. "I saw you holding back," Shaq said finally. "Why'd you go along with them at all?" Danny looked down at his boots, his shoulders slumping. "I didn't want to. But Rick, he's not the kind of guy you say no to. You saw what he's like." "Yeah, I saw," Shaq replied, "but you're not like him. So why stick around?" Danny didn't answer right away. He kicked at a loose piece of gravel on the ground, his brow furrowed. "I don't know," he admitted. "I guess I thought, maybe if I hung out with them, I'd feel like I belonged somewhere. But tonight," he trailed off, his voice breaking slightly. "Tonight, I saw who they really are, and I don't want to be like that." Shaq nodded slowly, his expression softening. "You've got a choice, kid. You can keep running with them, letting them drag you down. Or you can walk away and figure out who you really want to be." Danny looked up at him, something like hope flickering in his eyes. "You think I can?" "Yeah," Shaq said, "but you've got to decide for yourself." Danny nodded, his jaw tightening as if he'd made up his mind. "Thanks," he said quietly, "for not lumping me in with the rest of them." Without another word, Danny turned and walked away, his steps more confident than they'd been before. Shaq watched him go, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. He hoped the kid would follow through, but he knew that wasn't something he could control. As Danny disappeared into the night, Shaq's phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out and glanced at the screen. It was his insurance company returning his earlier call. He stepped away from the SUV and answered, explaining the situation and arranging for a tow truck to pick up the vehicle. The process was straightforward, but as he hung up, he couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the end of the night's events. Shaq leaned against the hood of the SUV, his gaze fixed on the dark stretch of road where the Thunder Riders had disappeared. He knew men like Rick didn't let things go easily. There was a storm brewing, and it was only a matter of time before it came back around. But Shaq wasn't afraid. He'd faced tougher opponents than a group of bikers, and he'd always come out on top. For now, though, all he could do was wait. And so he stood there, calm and resolute, a quiet giant in the middle of the wreckage, ready for whatever came next. The night deepened, and the once busy diner parking lot was now eerily quiet. The damaged SUV sat under the dim glow of the neon sign, a silent reminder of the chaos that had unfolded just hours before. Shaquille O'Neal remained nearby, leaning against the hood of his car, his massive frame almost blending with the shadows. The calm on his face belied the tension simmering beneath the surface. He had faced challenges far greater than this in his life, but something about tonight felt unfinished, as if a final chapter had yet to be written. A low hum of an approaching engine broke the silence. Shaq's eyes shifted toward the road, narrowing slightly as the sound grew louder. Moments later, a single motorcycle emerged from the darkness, its lone headlight cutting through the night like a blade. It wasn't the roar of the Thunder Riders returning en masse. It was just one rider. The motorcycle came to a slow stop at the edge of the lot, and its rider dismounted. As the figure stepped into the light, Shaq recognized him immediately. It was Danny, the youngest and most reluctant of the Thunder Riders. His leather jacket looked too big on him now, as if he no longer belonged in it, and his face was pale, though his expression was set with determination. "Hey," Danny said, his voice carrying just enough to reach Shaq without breaking the stillness of the night. Shaq didn't move from his spot, his arms crossed over his chest. "What are you doing back here, kid?" Danny hesitated, shoving his hands into his pockets. "I wanted to tell you something. About Rick." Shaq raised an eyebrow. "What about him?" "He's not done," Danny said quickly, the words tumbling out of him like a confession. "He's furious about what happened earlier. He's blaming you for making him look weak in front of the crew. He said he's coming back, with more guys." Shaq exhaled slowly, nodding as if he'd been expecting this. "You didn't have to warn me," he said, "but I appreciate it." Danny stepped closer, his shoulders tense. "I didn't want to be part of it anymore. After tonight, I'm done with them. I couldn't leave without making sure you knew." "You did the right thing," Shaq said, his tone steady. "But don't stick around here. If Rick's coming back, it's not safe for you." Danny hesitated, his gaze darting towards the dark road where he had come from. "What about you?" he asked. "You're just going to stand here and wait for him?" Shaq smiled faintly, the kind of smile that carried more confidence than bravado. "I've dealt with worse." Danny nodded, though he still looked uneasy. After a moment, he turned back to his bike and started the engine. "Good luck," he said, his voice barely audible over the rumble of the motorcycle. As Danny rode away, Shaq straightened up, his mind already shifting to what was to come. He didn't have to wait long. The distant roar of multiple engines reached his ears, growing louder with each passing second. It wasn't just Rick and his crew this time. It was a full contingent of bikers, at least a dozen by the sound of it. The thunder of their arrival was a stark contrast to the quiet that had settled over the town, and Shaq knew that this wasn't going to end with a simple conversation. The motorcycles poured into the parking lot like a wave of metal and leather, their riders dismounting in unison. Rick was at the head of the group, his face twisted with rage. He looked different now, more dangerous, more desperate. Behind him, the other bikers fanned out, forming a loose semicircle around Shaq. "Well, well," Rick said, his voice dripping with venom. "Looks like the big guy didn't know when to leave town." Shaq remained where he was, his posture relaxed but his eyes sharp. "I'm not the one who came back," he replied calmly. Rick's jaw tightened. "You made me look weak in front of my crew," he growled. "Nobody does that and gets away with it." Shaq's gaze swept over the assembled bikers, noting their body language, their weapons, their nerves. They were trying to intimidate him, but he could see the cracks in their confidence. "This isn't about me," he said. "It's about you. You can't handle the fact that your own crew saw you for what you are." Rick's face reddened, his hands balling into fists. "Shut up," he barked. "You don't know anything about me." "I know enough," Shaq said, "and I know you don't have to do this. You can still walk away." The bikers exchanged uncertain glances, but Rick wasn't swayed. He pulled a tire iron from his belt, pointing it at Shaq like a weapon. "I'm done talking," he spat. "Take him down." The bikers hesitated for a fraction of a second before surging forward. Shaq braced himself, his mind clear, his focus razor-sharp. The first biker swung a chain at him, but Shaq sidestepped the attack, grabbing the chain and yanking it out of the man's hands. He used it to deflect another swing from a second biker before tossing it aside. Another came at him with a baseball bat, but Shaq ducked under the swing and delivered a controlled shove that sent the man stumbling into his comrades. The movements were fluid, precise. Shaq wasn't just defending himself, he was controlling the fight. Rick stayed back, watching as his crew faltered. His frustration boiled over, and he charged at Shaq with the tire iron. Shaq caught the strike with both hands, his grip like iron, and wrenched the weapon away. He tossed it to the ground and fixed Rick with a steely glare. "It's over," Shaq said firmly. "You don't have to keep doing this." Rick's chest heaved, his anger warring with something else, fear. He looked around and saw his crew retreating, some nursing injuries, others simply unwilling to continue the fight. He was alone. For a moment, it seemed like Rick might lash out again, but then he dropped his hands, his shoulders slumping. He looked at Shaq, his expression hollow. Without a word, he turned and walked back to his motorcycle. The rest of the bikers followed his lead, their engines roaring as they fled into the night. As the last motorcycle disappeared, the parking lot fell silent once more. Shaq stood alone, the tension in his body slowly easing. He glanced at his SUV, then at the diner, where the manager and a few patrons had been watching from the windows. One of them stepped outside, clapping his hands slowly. "Man," the diner manager said, shaking his head in disbelief, "you just took down a whole gang." Shaq shrugged, a faint smile on his face. "Sometimes it's not about the fight," he said. "It's about knowing when to stand your ground." The manager nodded, clearly impressed. "Well, if you ever need a place to eat, this diner's got your back." Shaq chuckled softly, his calm demeanor returning. "I'll keep that in mind." As the manager walked back inside, Shaq turned his attention to his SUV. The damage was extensive, but he knew it could be fixed. And as he stood there, alone in the quiet of the night, he felt a deep sense of peace. He had faced the storm and come out stronger for it. The road ahead was long, but Shaq was ready for it. He always was. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories like this, and check out our other videos for even more exciting content. Share this video with your friends and let us know your thoughts in the comments below. See you in the next one.